You think the worst thing that can happen at your job is getting yelled at by your boss? Think again, because when a smug, entitled executive decided to run his fingers through the hair of the quiet woman everyone in the office loved to ignore, he had no idea he'd just made the last mistake of his career. He thought she was an easy target. He thought nobody would care. He had absolutely no clue that the silent man watching from the back of that boardroom wasn't just a billionaire CEO. He was the head of one of the deadliest crime families on the East Coast, and he'd been quietly obsessed with that woman for months. Stick around, because this one is a ride from start to finish. Penelope Gallagher knew exactly how much space she took up in the world. She knew because the world never let her forget it. She was a big woman, soft and full, with wide hips, a belly she worked hard to hide under carefully chosen blazers, and a thick, gorgeous mane of curly auburn hair that was honestly her favorite thing about herself. Penny, as the few kind people in her life called her, lived in a world built for thin people, and every single day reminded her of that fact in 100 small, cutting ways. But here's the thing about Penny. She was, without question, the sharpest financial auditor at her company, a massive corporate logistics firm headquartered in a gleaming glass skyscraper in downtown Boston. The woman could look at a spreadsheet the way a detective looks at a crime scene. She saw things other people missed. She caught mistakes that cost millions. She was, by any honest measure, brilliant. And brilliance, it turns out, doesn't protect you from cruelty. On the 14th floor, in those shiny corridors full of people in expensive vests who talked endlessly about their gym routines and their latest diet, Penny was treated like a piece of office furniture. Useful, invisible. The kind of person you dump your Friday afternoon workload onto because you just assume she's got nothing better to do with her weekend. Her co-workers looked at her with a blend of pity and quiet contempt. She was the big girl who was good with numbers. That was all she was allowed to be. And the absolute worst of them was a man named Bradley. Bradley was a vice president, the golden boy of the floor, the kind of guy who'd coasted his whole life on a sharp jawline, a trust fund, and a talent for taking credit for other people's work. He'd made it his personal hobby to remind Penny exactly where he thought she belonged. He'd bump into her at the coffee machine and apologize with a little smirk that made it clear he thought she was the one taking up too much room. He'd loudly announce his fasting schedule the second she opened her lunch. Little jabs. Constant. Designed to make her feel small, even though making her feel small was the one thing nobody could actually do, not with her body. And Penny took it. All of it. She needed the job. She needed the health insurance. She needed that paycheck to help cover her younger sister's college tuition. So she kept her head down, kept her hair pinned back neat and professional, and let her work speak for itself. But here's what Penny didn't know. That whole company, the logistics firm she'd given years of her life to, wasn't just a logistics firm. On the surface, sure. Shipping, acquisitions, global supply chains. But underneath all that polished corporate glass was one of the most powerful and dangerous organized crime families on the entire eastern seaboard. The shipping was a front. A beautiful billion-dollar disguise for moving illegal cargo, laundering enormous amounts of money, and dealing with rivals in ways that didn't involve lawyers. And the man who sat at the very top of both worlds was named Damien. To almost everyone in the building, Damien was a ghost, a name, a rumor. He ran things from the penthouse and rarely came down to mingle with the ordinary workers. He was a man of unsettling stillness, dark and sharp-featured, with the kind of presence that made a room go quiet without him saying a single word. He didn't waste his time micromanaging accountants and middle managers. His real work happened in the shadows. But Damien had a secret, and that secret was the reason he came down to the 14th floor a lot more often than his job actually required. He'd first noticed Penny about 6 months earlier, during a quarterly review. While everyone else in the room was glued to their phones or whispering to each other, Damien had watched this quiet, nervous woman stand at the front and calmly, methodically dismantle a fraudulent vendor contract that nobody else had even flagged. He'd noticed the blush that crept up her cheeks when people looked at her. He'd noticed the way the fire of pure intelligence lit up her eyes when she talked about the numbers. He'd noticed her in a way he hadn't noticed anyone in years. In Damien's world, Everyone was a predator or prey. Everyone wanted something. Everyone was angling, lying, calculating. But Penny was something he almost never encountered. She was real. She was warm. And he found himself more than once pulling up the security camera feeds in his office just to watch her work. He watched the way she bit her lip when she was concentrating. The way she rubbed her thighs when she'd been sitting too long. The way she'd quietly wipe a tear from her cheek after Bradley humiliated her in the break room one more time. His fascination had become something heavier, something possessive. He'd already had his most trusted man, a mountain of an enforcer named Dominic, run a full background check on her. Damien knew her address. He knew her coffee order. He knew exactly how much debt her family was carrying. He was just waiting for the right moment to pull her out of that miserable corporate grind and into the dangerous safety of his world. He just never expected Bradley to be the one to force his hand. It was a Tuesday in November, the sky outside the big windows a heavy, bruised purple. The conference room was packed for the year-end audit presentation, and Penny felt sick to her stomach. She'd spent 80 hours that week putting together a risk assessment on the company's European shipping routes, and what she'd found was alarming. Massive inconsistencies. Millions of dollars simply unaccounted for, funneled through shell companies overseas. It was a huge red flag, and she'd tried to bring it to Bradley privately. He'd waved her off and called her paranoid, so now she had to present it to the entire executive board. She stood at the head of the long table, her hands trembling just slightly. She wore a black wrap dress and was painfully aware of every inch of herself, the way the fabric pressed against her stomach, the way her arms looked under the harsh fluorescent lights. Bradley sat right beside her, leaning back in his chair with his hands behind his head, radiating boredom and arrogance. And in the back corner, half hidden in shadow, sat Damien himself. Penny's breath caught when she saw him. The CEO almost never came to these meetings. He was in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, and his dark eyes were locked onto her with an intensity that made the hair on the back of her neck stand straight up. "Proceed, Ms. Gallagher," he said. His voice was low and rough, and it brought instant silence to the room. Penny cleared her throat and clicked her remote. "Thank you, sir. If you look at the figures on page 4, you'll see a serious discrepancy in our third-quarter routing through the Mediterranean." For the next 20 minutes, she laid it all out. The bleeding money, the dummy corporations, the numbers that simply didn't add up. And as she went, her voice grew stronger, more confident, because the data was undeniable and the data was on her side. What she didn't realize, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that she was actually exposing a skimming operation being run by one of Damien's own crooked lieutenants. She didn't know any of that. She just knew the math was wrong. Bradley, meanwhile, was getting visibly nervous. The numbers Penny was uncovering pointed straight at his department's failures. And worse, in his mind, he couldn't stand watching the quiet woman he loved to torment actually commanding the respect and attention of the CEO himself. Okay, let's pump the brakes here, Penny," Bradley said loudly, standing up and walking right over to her. He crowded into her space, so close she could smell the mint gum and stale coffee on his breath. She froze, instinctively shrinking back until her shoulders hit the whiteboard behind her. "These numbers are purely theoretical," Bradley announced to the room, flashing a wide, dismissive grin. "Penny here tends to get a little overwhelmed, a little too focused on tiny details because she doesn't really grasp the bigger picture." Then he turned to her, his eyes glinting with something cruel and patronizing. He wanted to humiliate her. He wanted to remind every single person in that room exactly where he thought she stood. "You just need to relax, sweetheart," he said, loud enough for the table microphone to catch every word. And then he reached out. His hand didn't go for her shoulder. It went straight for her hair. Without a shred of permission, he plunged his fingers into those heavy auburn curls, gripped a thick handful, and stroked it the way you'd pat a dog before giving it a slight, condescending little tug. "Such a mess today," he murmured with a sneer. "You really should try to present yourself a little more professionally. Tame this down a bit. Wouldn't want people thinking you're as undisciplined as your diet, right?" The room went dead silent. For Penny, time seemed to break apart. The feeling of his fingers in her hair was a violation so deep it made her physically nauseous. It wasn't just a touch, it was a statement, a declaration that her body was public property, something anyone could grab and judge whenever they felt like it. And the comment about her weight, delivered as a punchline for the whole boardroom, knocked the air right out of her lungs. Hot, stinging tears welled up in her eyes as she stared at the floor, wishing more than anything that the ground would just open up and swallow her whole. And then, from the back of the room, a sharp, terrifying sound cracked through the silence. Snap. Damien had just broken a solid metal pen clean in half with one hand. Dark ink dripped down his knuckles and pooled on the table like blood. The silence that followed was a different kind entirely. It was pure, suffocating dread. Nobody was looking at Penny anymore. Every single eye in that room had locked onto the CEO, whose chair scraped loudly across the floor as he rose to his feet. Damien didn't walk. He stalked. He moved across that room with the smooth, lethal grace of a predator closing in. His face was a blank, terrifying mask, but his eyes, dark and bottomless, were fixed entirely on Bradley. Bradley's hand slowly slid out of Penny's hair. His smug grin flickered and died, replaced by a nervous, confused twitch. "Mr. Costa, I was just explaining to Penelope. Do not speak." Damien said it quietly, almost in a whisper, but the words carried a force that made the executives in the front row physically flinch. He stopped a few feet from Bradley, pulled a silk handkerchief from his pocket, and began calmly, methodically wiping the ink from his large, scarred hands. "Did you ask permission?" Damien asked. His eyes flicked for half a second to Penny, taking in her trembling shoulders and the tears she was fighting so hard to hold back. A muscle jumped in his jaw. "Excuse me?" Bradley stammered, every ounce of bravado draining away. "Did you ask Ms. Gallagher for permission to put your hands on her body?" Damien repeated, stepping closer. Bradley let out a weak, nervous laugh, glancing around the room for any kind of support. "Sir, I was just... Her hair was out of place. We're colleagues. It was friendly." Damien moved so fast the eye could barely follow it. His hand shot out, not to strike, but to wrap around Bradley's throat in a grip like a steel clamp. Bradley gasped, his own hands flying up to claw uselessly at Damien's wrist. Damien didn't squeeze hard enough to kill, just hard enough to cut off his air entirely, lifting the man clean off the floor. The room erupted in gasps. A few executives jumped up in a panic, but a single glance from Damien froze them solid. "You put your filthy hands on her," Damien whispered, leaning in so only Bradley and Penny could hear. "You humiliated her. You laid hands on something that belongs to me." Penny's breath caught hard in her throat. "Belongs to me?" She stared at Damien's broad back, her mind spinning. He dropped Bradley. The man crumpled to the floor, gagging and coughing, scrambling backward like a frightened animal. And then Damien slowly turned his head and looked at the rest of the room, at the terrified executives, the complacent managers, all the people who'd sat by for years and watched Penny get treated like she was nothing. "This department," he said, his voice cold as ice, "is a cancer. Not only did you let $10 million in diverted funds slip right past you, funds that Ms. Gallagher had to find for you, but you've built a culture of disrespect that I find deeply, personally offensive." He pulled out his phone and pressed a single button. Within seconds, the heavy doors of the boardroom swung open and 6 men in dark suits walked in. They did not look like corporate security. Thick necks, cold, dead eyes, the kind of men who handled problems permanently. At their head was Dominic, Damien's enormous right-hand man. "Lock down the floor," Damien ordered without even glancing at them. "Cut all server access. Take every laptop, every phone, every file." Panic rippled through the executives. "Sir, you can't just..." a senior director started. "I am shutting down this entire department, effective immediately," Damien announced, slicing right through the noise. "Your services are no longer required. You have exactly 5 minutes to grab your coats. If you try to take a single sheet of paper, a single flash drive, or if you say one more word of complaint, My men will personally escort you down to the parking garage, and I promise you, you will not enjoy that elevator ride." The room dissolved into terrified chaos. The executives, sensing the very real threat in the air, shoved past each other to get out. Bradley was hauled up by his collar and physically dragged out the door, weeping. In less than 3 minutes, that enormous boardroom was empty. Overturned chairs, scattered papers, and just 2 people left standing in the wreckage. Penny was frozen against the whiteboard, her heart slamming against her ribs. She felt utterly exposed, suddenly aware of her own breathing, the absurd, impossible reality of what had just happened. The CEO of a massive company had just shut down an entire department, ended dozens of careers, all because a coworker touched her hair. Damien turned slowly to face her. The terrifying aura of violence that had filled the room moments before seemed to soften, replaced by something warmer, heavier. He took a step toward her, and she instinctively shrank back. "Mr. Costa, I don't understand." "Damien," he corrected gently. He stopped a respectful distance away, his dark eyes moving over her face, taking in her frightened expression and the lingering flush of humiliation on her cheeks. "Are you hurt, Penelope?" "Hurt? No, he just pulled my hair," she whispered, her hands nervously clutching the fabric of her dress over her stomach, a defensive posture she'd carried since she was a teenager. "But you fired everyone. The whole department." "Over me?" His eyes dropped briefly to her hands gripping her dress, a flicker of something raw crossing his face before he hid it. "I fired them because they were stealing from me," he said smoothly, lying to spare her the full shock of it. The truth was he'd have burned the whole building down over a single one of her tears. "But I broke Jenkins because he touched you." He took one final step forward, into her space. But unlike Bradley, he didn't bring fear. He brought a warmth that was almost overwhelming. He raised his hand and paused, inches from her face, waiting, asking, without words, for her permission. Mesmerized, Penny gave the tiniest nod. His large, rough fingers gently found the exact lock of hair Bradley had yanked. He didn't pull it. He carefully, almost reverently, tucked it behind her ear, his thumb just barely grazing the soft curve of her jaw. "Nobody disrespects you, Penelope," he murmured, his voice a dark promise that sent a shiver straight down her spine. "Nobody touches you, not ever again, unless I allow it." The elevator ride up to the penthouse was a lesson in unbearable tension. Penny stood stiffly in the corner of the polished cab, twisting the fabric of her dress between her fingers. The air smelled of leather and his cologne, something spicy and expensive. She kept her eyes glued to the floor numbers climbing higher and higher, feeling like none of this could possibly be real. 20 minutes ago, she'd been an invisible auditor terrified of losing her benefits. Now she was riding up to the penthouse beside a billionaire who'd just leveled an entire department because a man touched her hair. Damien stood next to her, silent, radiating that dark, dangerous energy. And in the mirrored walls, Penny couldn't stop noticing herself. Next to his lean, broad frame, she felt impossibly large and awkward. Her hips brushed the railing. Her dress pulled at her middle. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing she could just shrink down to nothing. "Stop doing that," Damien's deep voice rumbled. Her eyes snapped open. "Doing what?" "Hiding." He turned fully toward her, blocking her reflection, his dark eyes moving openly over her. "You fold yourself up like you're apologizing for existing, Penelope. I don't want you to apologize. Not in my building, and certainly not in front of me." "I'm not exactly built for the penthouse," she whispered, her voice trembling with that deep, worn-in insecurity. "I don't belong up here." He closed the distance between them, his hand wrapping gently around her soft upper arm. The contrast was startling, his skin tanned and scarred, hers pale and soft. "You belong exactly where I put you," he said, the words a quiet, possessive vow. "And I've decided to put you at the top." The elevator chimed and the doors slid open onto a vast glass-walled space that looked more like a fortress than an office. Black marble floors stretched toward windows that framed the entire Boston skyline. But for all that beauty, the place was cold and bare. No photographs, no plants, no personal touches, just a massive slab of dark stone for a desk and a few leather chairs. "Sit," Damien said, guiding her to a velvet sofa. He didn't let go of her arm until she was safely seated, the cushions sinking under her. Before she could even take it all in, heavy doors at the far end opened and Dominic strode in, carrying a stack of hard drives and a thick folder. He barely glanced at her. "It's done, boss," he reported in a low, grating voice. "The floor is sterilized. Jenkins is downstairs crying like a baby. But we've got a serious complication." Damien's jaw tightened. He leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "Speak," Gallagher's ordered. Dominic finally cast a heavy, measuring look at the terrified woman on the couch. "Those overseas accounts she flagged? They're not just our own guys skimming off the top. I ran the routing numbers. The money's flowing straight into accounts controlled by the Moretti family." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Penny had no idea who the Morettis were, but the pure, murderous darkness that flooded Damien's face made her blood freeze. "Jenkins was a rat," Damien said softly. The quiet of his voice was somehow far more frightening than a shout. "Yes," Dominic confirmed. "But it gets worse. When we tossed his office, we found a burner phone. He sent a message right before the presentation. He warned the Morettis that the accounts were being audited, and he gave them the name of the auditor." Penny's heart stopped. The blood drained from her face. "He gave them my name?" she choked out, her hands flying to her mouth. "Why would he do that? I'm just an accountant." Damien crossed the room in a few strides and crouched down in front of her, taking her trembling hands in his warm, calloused ones. "Because, Penelope, you are a brilliant and dangerous woman," he said, his eyes burning into hers. "You saw through a maze of financial deception that my own forensic accountants missed for a year. You unraveled a multi-million-dollar laundering operation with a single spreadsheet. To the Morettis, you're not just an accountant, you're a threat. You have the ability to take their entire operation apart just by following the math." "I don't want to take anything apart," Penny cried, a tear finally slipping down her cheek. "I just wanted to do my job. I have a sister in college. I have a mortgage." "And you have me," Damien interrupted, his voice dropping low with absolute certainty. He reached up and wiped the tear away with his thumb. "The Morettis don't send lawyers, Penelope. They send killers. Which means your quiet civilian life ended the second Jenkins touched your hair." She stared at him, her mind unable to process the size of the nightmare she'd stumbled into. "So, I'm fired?" she asked, and the ordinary, mundane question sounded absurd even to her own ears. A dark, surprised chuckle rumbled in his chest. He leaned in close, his lips brushing near her ear. "No. You're promoted. You're moving into my estate. You'll be under my protection. And if a single one of their men comes within 100 yards of you, I will paint the streets of this city red." The shift from invisible office worker to protected royalty happened in a terrifying blur. Within the hour, Penny was flanked by armed men, hurried through an underground garage, and buckled into the back of an armored SUV. The convoy tore through the rain-slicked streets, heading north toward the dense forests of the coast. Inside, the silence was heavy. Penny pressed herself against the reinforced glass, arms wrapped around her waist. Even in the wide leather seat, she felt like she was taking up too much room. Damien sat beside her, perfectly calm, reading something on a tablet, completely unbothered by the fact that they were fleeing a possible mob hit. "You haven't eaten," he observed without looking up. He reached into a cooler between the seats and pulled out a small box of fancy chocolates and a bottle of sparkling water, setting them gently on her lap. Penny looked down at the food, and a wave of old, familiar shame washed over her. "I'm not hungry," she lied. The truth was she was starving, but years of Bradley's cruel jokes, years of a world telling her that women her size should only ever eat salads, had trained her to feel guilty about eating anything in front of an attractive man. Damien lowered the tablet. He turned and looked at her with a piercing focus, and he saw right through the lie. He saw the shame underneath it, and it made him angry. "Penelope," he said, his tone commanding but somehow soft. "Look at me." She turned slowly. "Do you know why I watched you in the cafeteria?" Her eyes went wide. You watched me?" "Every day," he admitted, with zero shame for it. "I watched you eat your sad, dry salads. I watched you look at the bakery counter with a hunger you forced yourself to crush because of the judgmental stares of hollow, pathetic people. People who are now, thanks to me, unemployed." He leaned closer, his cologne wrapping around her. "I despise those people. I despise weakness. And starving yourself to please a world that doesn't deserve you is weakness." He carefully opened the box of chocolates and picked out a dark truffle dusted with cocoa. "You are a magnificent, beautiful woman, Penelope. Your softness is something rare in a world that's brutally hard. I want it. I want to protect it. And I want to ruin any man who ever tells you to be less than you are." He held the truffle up to her lips. "Eat. For me." Her breath hitched. Nobody had ever spoken to her like this. Nobody had ever looked at her body and seen something to treasure instead of something to fix. Trembling, she parted her lips, and he fed her the chocolate, his thumb lingering against her lower lip as the rich sweetness melted on her tongue. A deep, terrifying warmth bloomed low in her stomach. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a problem. She felt wanted. The estate appeared out of the fog an hour later, a fortress of stone tucked into 50 acres of forest, ringed by high walls and armed patrols. Damien walked her inside himself. The interior was breathtaking, all vaulted ceilings, old tapestries, dark polished wood. But beneath the luxury, the truth of her situation was impossible to ignore. Armed guards at every hallway, reinforced windows, a gilded cage, and she was the prize bird inside it. "Dominic will show you to your room," Damien said, slipping back into his commanding tone as his men crowded him with reports. "Rest. We'll talk strategy in the morning." Penny was led up a sweeping staircase to a room larger than her entire apartment, complete with a 4-poster bed and a roaring fireplace. And then, she was alone. The adrenaline finally crashed, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. She walked to the tall mirror and stared at herself. Wild hair, smudged makeup, wrinkled dress. She wrapped her arms around her middle as the full weight of the day finally landed. She was a target for a rival crime family. She was a prisoner in a billionaire's fortress, and she was terrifyingly drawn to a man who killed people for a living. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Before she could answer, the door opened. It wasn't Damien. It was a woman, maybe in her late 50s, in a black maid's uniform, pushing a silver cart of covered dishes. But something was wrong. The woman's hands were shaking. Her eyes darted around the room with a feverish, panicked energy. "Mr. Costa ordered dinner for you, miss," the woman said in an accent that sounded forced. Penny frowned and stepped away from the mirror. "Thank you. Just leave it by the fire." The woman pushed the cart forward, but as she reached into her apron, her sleeve slid up, revealing a stark blue tattoo on her inner wrist. A coiled serpent. Penny froze. She was an auditor. She noticed details. And she remembered the files Dominic had shown Damien, the ones listing the rival family's known markings. The coiled serpent was the mark of their hit squad. "Wait," Penny said, her heart slamming. "Who are you?" The woman's whole face changed in an instant, from meek servant to cold-blooded killer. She lunged, ripping a silenced pistol out from beneath the serving tray. Penny didn't think. She reacted, and she used the one thing she'd spent her whole life hating about herself, her size, her weight. She didn't run. She charged. She threw her entire body forward and slammed into the assassin like a freight train. The woman let out a stunned gasp as Penny's shoulder drove into her chest, sending them both crashing into a heavy antique table. The pistol went off with a muffled cough, the bullet shattering a vase inches from Penny's head. Penny scrambled, pinning the woman's arm to the carpet with her knee, her weight making it impossible for the smaller attacker to move. "Damien!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the manor. "Damien!" The response was instant. The heavy doors burst open, splintering the frame. Damien exploded into the room, a rifle already up to his shoulder, Dominic and 3 armed men pouring in behind him. His eyes locked onto the scene. Penny, trembling, but fiercely holding the assassin down, the pistol lying useless on the rug. Slowly, Damien lowered his weapon. The murderous rage in his eyes transformed into something else entirely. A dark, almost awed smile crept across his lips. He walked over, crushing broken porcelain under his boots, looked down at the pinned assassin, then at Penny, his eyes blazing with something close to worship. "I told you," he whispered, his voice thick with possessive pride. "You are a very dangerous woman." The bitter smell of gunpowder hung in the air as Dominic and his men moved with terrifying efficiency, disarming the thrashing assassin, binding her wrists, and dragging her out of the room. Penny stayed on the floor, chest heaving, knees shaking too hard to stand. She stared at the spot where the gun had fallen, her mind struggling to catch up with what she'd just done. She had tackled a professional killer. Her. The quiet woman who apologized when strangers bumped into her at the grocery store. She'd thrown herself into a life-or-death fight, and won. Damien didn't call his men to help her up. With a predator's instinct, he understood that she'd just crossed a line within herself, something deeply personal. He dropped his rifle onto the sofa and knelt down on the broken glass without a second thought, reaching out with his scarred hands. "Look at me, Penelope." She lifted her head. Her curls were wild, stuck to her damp forehead. Her dress was twisted, bearing the soft curve of her thigh, but she didn't try to cover herself. The shame was simply gone, burned away by survival. "You're unharmed?" he asked, scanning her face, his thumb brushing dirt from her cheek. "I'm okay," she stammered. "She missed. I saw the tattoo. The serpent. I knew what it meant, and I didn't think. I just threw my weight at her." A dark smile curved his lips. He leaned in, resting his forehead against hers. "Your weight is a weapon, Penelope. Your softness is your armor. You didn't freeze. You didn't cower. You fought. You protected my home." He pulled back, his eyes burning. "They thought you were weak. They thought they could send one rat into my house to quietly remove an accountant. They badly underestimated the queen I brought into my world." That word, queen, hung heavy in the air, and Penny realized with startling clarity that she didn't want to run. The corporate world had treated her like garbage. This dangerous man looked at her like she'd been forged in fire. And then her analytical brain kicked back in, slicing right through the shock. "If they sent someone here," she said slowly, "it means they know I found those accounts. But it also means Jenkins wasn't working alone. He was a mid-level VP. He didn't have the clearance to authorize those shell company transfers without setting off the company's automated oversight alerts. Someone higher up had to bypass the system for him." Damien's smile vanished, replaced by cold calculation. "You're certain?" "I'm an auditor, Damien," she said, her voice steadying, gaining a quiet authority. "Math doesn't lie. Jenkins was the courier. But someone else is holding the keys to the vault. I need to see the raw server data. Now." 10 minutes later, Damien led her deep below the estate, where an elevator opened onto the true heart of his empire. A high-tech war room. Walls lined with massive monitors showing satellite feeds, encrypted ledgers, global shipping data. A dozen men in suits at terminals, the air humming with servers and low, urgent conversation. The room went dead silent the moment Damien entered. Every man stood and looked away respectfully. "Clear the main terminal," Damien ordered. The lead tech scrambled out of the way. Damien pulled out the chair himself and gestured for Penny to sit. As she took her place at the nerve center of a criminal empire, she felt the ground shift beneath her entire reality. "Dominic," she said, not even turning around, her voice ringing with new confidence. Give me the drives you pulled from Jenkins' office and get me a direct, unfiltered connection to the company mainframe. I'm going to tear their routing apart." For the next 2 hours, the room watched in mesmerized silence as Penny worked. Her fingers flew across the keys. She blew past security walls that had stumped Damien's best hackers, using her intimate knowledge of the company's old, clunky legacy systems. She cross-referenced shell companies with offshore bank numbers, digging through layer after layer of digital camouflage. Damien stood behind her the whole time, his hands resting on her shoulders, thumbs occasionally working the tension out of her neck, a small grounding gesture that kept the panic at bay. "Got it," she suddenly whispered, her eyes widening at the data scrolling across the screen. "Talk to me," Damien rumbled, leaning down. "It's a laundering technique," she explained, pointing. "They break huge illegal transactions into thousands of tiny, innocent-looking corporate expenses. But look at the authorization codes. Every single one was approved by a special override protocol. And there is exactly one executive in the entire company with the key to that protocol." She hit enter, pulling up a classified profile. A photograph filled the screen. Damien's grip on her shoulders went tight. The man on the screen was Harrison, the company's chief financial officer. Damien's oldest ally, a man who had attended Damien's own father's funeral. "Harrison!" Dominic spat from the shadows, his hand dropping to his weapon. "That treacherous snake. He's been selling us out from the very top." "Wait, there's more," Penny cut in, her eyes racing across a second ledger she'd just cracked. Her heart began to pound. The money isn't just being skimmed. It's being pooled, $300 million in untraceable cash. And Harrison initiated a wire transfer 10 minutes ago to a company owned by the Morettis. It clears at midnight. She frowned. But why move that much cash tonight? It's too loud, too fast. She typed in another command, pulling up GPS data for the company's shipping fleet. She gasped. "Damien," she said, spinning her chair to face him. "They're not just stealing your money. They're buying an army. That wire transfer is a payment for a black market weapons shipment arriving at the harbor, Pier 44. The ship docks in 1 hour. Harrison is handing them the firepower to wipe your entire family off the map." The war room exploded into motion. Dominic barked orders, strike teams pulling on body armor and grabbing weapons. The betrayal of Harrison was a knife to the heart of the family. But there was no time to grieve. There was only time for war. Damien didn't move. He stood looking down at Penny, a storm building in his dark eyes. He reached down and cupped her face in both scarred hands. "You just saved my life, my family, and my entire empire, Penelope," he said, his voice a low rasp. "You saw what my best men couldn't." "You have to stop that ship," she urged, gripping his wrists. "If those weapons clear the docks, they'll outgun you." "I'll burn that pier to ash," Damien swore. He leaned down and pressed a hard, claiming kiss to her lips, a brand and a promise all at once. "Stay here. Lock the blast doors. If anyone but me tries to enter, Dominic has left a loaded weapon on the console. You know what to do." With one last look at her flushed face, he turned and stalked out, a general marching to war. For the next 45 minutes, Penny sat in the deafening silence of the bunker, surrounded by guards who now looked at her with genuine respect. She kept her eyes glued to the monitors, watching the GPS marker of Damien's convoy race toward the harbor. She'd tapped into the team's encrypted radio, listening to the tense, clipped chatter. She watched the markers surround the pier. She heard the slow, agonizing countdown. "Breach, breach, breach!" Damien's voice, cold and merciless, and then the radio erupted into chaos. Automatic gunfire, the heavy thud of explosions, shouts. Penny clamped her hands over her mouth, tears welling up. She was an auditor. She dealt in spreadsheets, not bloodshed. But she couldn't look away. She was bound to this world now, bound to him. Then a discrepancy on her monitor caught her eye. She stared at the thermal satellite feed over the pier. Damien's men were pushing toward the cargo ship, suppressing the enemy. But on the edge of the screen, she caught movement. 3 armored SUVs, running completely dark with no headlights, were sliding in from the western warehouses, flanking Damien's position. It was a pincer, an ambush. Harrison had anticipated the raid and set a trap. "Damien!" Penny screamed, lunging for the comms button. "Damien, pull back! It's a trap! 3 vehicles, heavy armor, coming from the western warehouses. They're trying to box you in." Over the gunfire, she heard his sharp intake of breath. "Dominic, western flank. Redirect heavy weapons." Penny watched in agonizing suspense as the formation shifted. The ambusher's element of surprise was destroyed. Instead of catching Damien's men in a crossfire, the SUVs drove straight into a wall of concentrated fire. On her screen, the 3 vehicles bloomed into bright bursts of orange heat. Annihilated. The battle turned in an instant. The surviving enemy soldiers, realizing the ambush had failed and the shipment was lost, broke and ran. "Pier 44 is secured." Damien's voice crackled, heavy with exertion but victorious. "The weapons are ours, and I have Harrison. He was hiding in the harbor master's office like a coward." Penny collapsed back into her chair, burying her face in her hands, as a sob of pure relief tore through her. She had done it. She had guided them through the dark. 2 hours later, the blast doors hissed open, and Damien walked in, looking like a demon dragged up from somewhere terrible. His suit was ruined, torn, soaked in blood that wasn't his own. He was bruised and exhausted and radiating raw power. He dismissed the remaining guards with a flick of his wrist, leaving the 2 of them alone in the glow of the monitors. Penny stood slowly. She didn't care about the blood. She didn't care about the violence. She saw the man who had looked at her ignored, dismissed body and seen something worth protecting. She crossed the room, her hips swaying, moving with a confidence she'd never had before in her life. Damien stopped in the center of the room, chest heaving as he watched her come to him. "Harrison has been dealt with," he said softly. "The board is finished. The Moretti family is broken. Their operations are crushed." He reached out, his bloody hands hesitating for just a fraction of a second, before Penny closed the distance and wrapped her soft arms around his waist, burying her face against his chest, breathing in smoke and blood and the man himself. Damien let out a shuddering breath and wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her thick auburn curls, pulling her flush against him, groaning as her softness molded perfectly against his battered frame. "You are not an auditor anymore, Penelope," he whispered fiercely into her ear. "You are the new chief financial officer of this entire organization. You will command my wealth. You will stand at my side. And I swear, on my life, no one in this world will ever look down on you, disrespect you, or touch a single hair on your head again. You are mine, my brilliant, beautiful queen." Penny tipped her head back and looked into his dark, possessive eyes. She felt the full weight of her body, but for the first time ever it wasn't a burden. It was an anchor. It was power. "I'm yours, Damien," she whispered, pulling his face down to hers for a deep, breathless kiss that sealed her fate completely. She had walked into that building as a ghost. She walked out of the ashes as royalty. So tell me this. Did you see Harrison's betrayal coming? Or did that one catch you off guard like it caught Damien? And here's the bigger question I keep coming back to. Was Penny's transformation a love story? Or was it something darker? A woman finally finding her power in the one place the rest of the world told her she'd never belong? Because there's something undeniable about a person who spends their whole life being underestimated and then walks into a room and proves every single doubter dead wrong. If Penny's journey hit you right in the chest, if you felt that fire when she charged that assassin and that thrill when she cracked the code that saved everything, then do me a favor and smash that like button. It really does help more than you'd think. Share this story with someone who loves a fierce heroine and a dangerous, devoted hero. And if you want more stories exactly like this one, packed with twists, passion, and characters who refuse to stay invisible, make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. And drop a comment down below. Tell me your favorite moment from the whole thing. Was it the boardroom? The chocolate in the SUV? The war room? I read every single one, and your favorite scene just might inspire the next story I tell. So don't be shy. Let's hear it.